Hey guys, welcome to the Deeper Bible Podcast. Our goal is to go deep into the scriptures, into big ideas and theology, philosophy, culture, and with an eye to how it lands in our everyday world. So happy that you're here. And hey, if you believe in what Deeper is doing, would you consider giving a one-time or recurring gift? Your support is what helps us put together episodes and to get the word out there to reach people, to build a team. We'd be very, very grateful. Also, if this episode's helpful for you, will you click like, share, leave a comment, let us know your questions, be part of the conversation. We would totally love that. I'm Ryan. I'm sitting here today with my friend Destiny.
Hey, everyone.
And today we're going to square up to a variety of issues that are all thematized together because they have to do with violence. Questions about guns, war, abortion, and the death penalty. And the question is, what does the Bible say about these things? How should Christians approach these things? Does the Bible speak in one voice about all these things, or is there nuance? And we're going to get into the weeds a bit today on that. And let me just say straight out of the gate, I'm a little bit out of my depth here in that there's a whole field called Christian ethics, the people who are ethicists, and I am not one of those. So I'm trying to work through what I think, but what we're going to do is have some starting points from the Bible and try to reason biblically towards thoughtful positions on these pretty controversial topics. So, Destiny, thanks for being part of this.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ryan. I'm excited. I think this is not just relevant, but it weighs in on all of our lives. Mm-hmm. Each of us have been touched by this in some way. Yep. And I look forward to our conversation. I think for us, being Christians, we have a particular duty to think faithfully about this biblically. And how do we begin to shape an idea of what the Bible has to say or how it speaks to the issue of violence? Where do we start when we want to start that conversation?
Yeah. So like most things in Christian thinking, you need to start at the beginning of the Bible. The beginning of the Bible is super strategic in the narrative trajectory that it is setting. And if you miss early Genesis and how it is setting up the world, it is very, very easy to misunderstand what subsequent parts of the Bible teach on this. So I want to spend a minute here.
Yeah, let's do that.
Genesis 12 is when Abraham comes into the picture. And thereafter, the story of the Old Testament is about Abraham and his family and the nations, but it centers on the people of Israel. Mm-hmm. Prior to that, in Genesis 1 through 11, it's very, very key narrative block. Scholars call it the prehistory. And there are several junctures in the prehistory that are utterly important for thinking through what the Bible has to say about violence. So I just want to walk us through these. So in Genesis chapter 4, right after Adam and Eve have been kicked out of the garden, you have the first murder. Cain murders his brother Abel.
Yep.
And there's a fascinating conversation between God and Cain right before he's going to commit the crime. Mm-hmm. God comes up and says, whoa, Cain. Sin is like a predator sitting outside your door. It's licking its lips. It wants to devour you. You must rule over this thing. And Cain doesn't, and he goes and sheds blood. Mm-hmm. God says then to Cain after, he says, is not your brother's blood crying out to me from the ground? So it's very clear in Genesis 4, God is really opposed to this violent interaction. Mm-hmm. And then later on in Genesis chapter 4, we start getting into these genealogies, and we meet a guy named Lamech. Now, the name itself is interesting. Lamech in Hebrew is like the name king with two letters reversed. Mm-hmm. The word king is melech, and Lamech takes the L sound and the M sound and reverses them. Why is that important? Because the way Genesis 1 is set up and 2 is set up is that God is the high king and humans have a royal function.
Yes, right.
They're kings and queens. Mm-hmm. So the Bible is subtly narrating the devolution, the distortion of the royal vocation.
Yes.
And this Lamech guy, he's the first polygamist. He takes 2 wives. So, you read the Old Testament and everybody's got a lot of wives, and you're like, well, I guess the Bible's okay with that. No, it's not. You've missed the narrative logic.
Yeah.
That the introduction of more than one spouse is seen as a move in the wrong direction.
Right.
But then this Lamech guy is exponentially violent. He it's like the first rap in the Bible. He brags to his wives. I'm in Genesis 4, verse 23. Lamech said to his wives, Adah and Zillah, hear my voice. You wives of Lamech, listen to what I have to say. Seems like a really nice guy. I've killed a man for wounding me, a young man for striking me. So notice how disproportionate it is. Somebody just bumped me and I offed him. He's upping this, and then he says, if Cain's revenge is sevenfold, then Lamech's is 77-fold.
Yep.
And Jesus seems to riff on this when I think Peter comes up and asks him one day, Lord, how many times should I forgive my brother if he sins against me? Maybe 7? And Jesus quotes Lamech to kind of turn back this tragedy and says, no, 77 times, yes? Yeah. So things are moving in the wrong direction. Then we keep moving, and the story of the flood is really key. Why does God decide to flood the world? Genesis 6, I'm going to read verses 11 through 13. They say this, now the earth was corrupt in God's sight. How was it corrupt? In what way? And the earth was filled with violence. And God saw the earth, and behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth. So there's all sorts of things that could have gone wrong, but God seems to identify violence as like for him, it's the red line. He's like, I've had it. This is hopelessly wrong. We need to start again from fresh. And then on the other side of the flood story, God starts again with Noah and his family, and there's like a creation 2.0 scene. I want to read this passage in chapter 9 of Genesis, and it's all the language of Genesis 1, be fruitful, multiply, blessing, all that stuff, but now there are some new elements. So listen to this. And God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth. Genesis 1. The fear of you and the dread of you shall be upon every beast of the earth, and every bird of the heavens, upon everything that creeps on the ground, all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. This is a new element. In early Genesis, humans are given to manage the animal world, but there's not a relationship of dread and fear. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. As I gave you, past tense, the green plants, I give you everything. So now it's like God has reconciled the idea that there's violence in this world, even humans on animals, animals on animals. Right. And he says, okay, you can eat meat. The idea is you were vegetarians prior. Okay, fine, you can eat meat. But you shall not eat flesh with its life in it, that is its blood. And for your lifeblood, I will require a reckoning. From every beast, I will require it, and from man, from his fellow man, I will require a reckoning for the life of man. Like, what does that mean? What is a reckoning for lifeblood? Well, this next verse is key, Genesis 9:6. It's a little poem in Hebrew. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image. So why is it, if you kill somebody, you should yourself be put to death? Why? Because you have obliterated an image of God. Interesting. And then it rounds off with more creation language. And you, be fruitful and multiply, increase greatly on the earth, and multiply in it. So this is a very, very important passage. But it's important to see the shift away from early Genesis, where it's like, there's not violence, even with animals. Right. So like now, okay, fine. I mean, you're going to go eat animals, so I guess I'll let you. So we're getting a sense here. Then in Genesis 10, we meet a guy named Nimrod. And let me read you about Nimrod. Nimrod, he was the first on earth to be a mighty man. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. Interesting. So he's hunting animals. Therefore it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord, the beginning of his kingdom was Babel. That is Babylon. He's the king of Babylon. Erech, Akkad, Calneh, in the land of Shinar. From that land he went into Assyria and built Nineveh. Now, in the broader biblical imagination, Babylon and Nineveh are like the evil empire.
Yes.
So the first hunter, by the way, Nimrod's name comes from the Hebrew root mered, which means rebel. This guy's rebellious. He's the king of the evil empire, and he's butchering animals. Interesting. This is the kind of stuff that you can just kind of glaze over, like, names, genealogies, blah, blah, blah. No, this is the narrative theology that frames the whole issue. And then in chapter 11, we get the hubris of the Babylonians. They build this tower. It's not in the text, but of course, all epic architecture back in the day was built with slaves. It was built, violently. And so here's the upshot. This is so key. As we finish the primeval history, Genesis 1 through 11, we need to realize that Abraham and everybody after him are moving into a suboptimal world. It is not how God intended it to be. In fact, it grieves God that the world is this way. Well, actually, one other fascinating point. So the rainbow in Genesis 9, God puts a rainbow up in the sky. The Hebrew word for bow is keshet. And it is very clearly, it's not like a bow tie. It is very clearly the word for the weapon of a bow and arrow.
A war bow.
Yes. And what's fascinating is the bow is aimed up into the heart of heaven, as if to say, I have sworn by myself at my own expense, I will not destroy the world again this way. But it's the language of weaponry. And so it's important as we read, the rest of the Bible exists in a violent world. We live in a violent world. But it's important to understand that is not optimal. It is a tragic situation that there is violence. And God, because of his commitment to the continuation of humankind, has to operate within those constraints. So that's a starting point.
Yep.
There's also a couple other data points that we should be aware of from the Bible before we get to the specifics of guns and so forth.
Right.
So in 1 Chronicles chapter 22, David wants to build the temple of the Lord, but he's disallowed. And this is what we read. I'm in 1 Chronicles 22, verse 6 and following. Then he called for Solomon his son and charged him to build a house for the Lord, the God of Israel. David said to Solomon, my son, I had it in my heart to build a house for the name of the Lord my God, but the word of the Lord came to me, saying, you have shed much blood and have waged great wars. You shall not build a house to my name, because you have shed so much blood before me on the earth. Behold, a son shall be born to you, who shall be a man of rest. I will give him rest from all his surrounding enemies, for his name shall be Solomon. In Hebrew, it's Shlomo, which is shalom, Shlomo. And I will give shalom, peace, and quiet to Israel in his days. He shall build a house for my name. He shall be my son. I will be his father, and I will establish his royal throne in Israel forever. So apparently there's something incompatible about a man of violence building the place where God's temple is to reside. It's just like, this is a no-go. God doesn't say, David, you committed adultery, so it's not going to happen. David, you raised the taxes, so it's not going to happen. He says, David, you shed blood, so not going to happen. Another very important passage, and this is a riff that occurs 3 times in the prophetic corpus. First of all, in early Isaiah, which is the beginning of the writing prophets. Isaiah 2, verse 4. It's talking about God. He shall judge between the nations, shall decide disputes for many peoples. So the frame is beyond Israel. And they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Now the imagery here, it's like ancient wars and farming, so it's a little opaque.
Well, hold on. Can I guess something real quick?
Sure.
When I hear violent weapons turning to farm tools.
Yes.
Farm tools kind of evoke this idea of cultivation, of stewardship, of care. And that really aligns well with the royal role that humans were originally given.
Yeah.
And how incompatible cultivation and stewardship and thriving economies of socially and as well as with the actual earth, like the actual creation that God made.
Right.
Violence violence is incompatible with those things. You think of how many people fall into poverty in war, how often crops and a means to live economically gets decimated. Yep. And so I think of that and I'm like, wow, the Bible's actually so bright to make such a quick-handed way of nodding to that. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Because God understands fundamentally the catastrophic effect that violence has on our lives.
Yeah. And this is such a powerful image of saying, take this thing. It's this long, pointy, sharp thing. Mm-hmm. Don't use it to poke your neighbor. Use it to poke the ground, to make the ground come to. Don't put your neighbor to death. Make the ground come to life. Mm-hmm. You got this long shaft thing.
Yeah.
Don't use it to run people through. Use it to harvest grapes.
Yeah.
I actually just around the corner, we've got this massive naval facility called the Concord Naval Weapons Station.
Yes,
and during World Wars II, especially, it was like where we stored.
I've always wanted to explore that place.
Yeah, I know. It's a vast tract of land, undeveloped, and it's got bunkers for missiles and bombs and stuff.
Yes,
and it's been a long thing about how it's going to be developed. But anyways, I actually wrote a letter to the Concord City Council. When it was in public deliberation saying, here's why you need to develop this land. Because the Bible talks about turning places of warfare into places of fruitfulness. And I used this verse. I said, let's turn our swords into plowshares. Let's turn our missile silos into something where people can flourish. And do you know what happened? They didn't write me back. I'm really still mad about it. Okay. So Isaiah says this.
Yes.
Micah chapter 4, verse 3 says the exact same thing. Now, Joel in Joel 3:10 twists it around and says, take your plowshares, which is basically like your implement for, turning up the soil. Right. Take your plowshares and turn those into swords. Take your pruning sticks and make those into spears. And so there's constantly this dialectic between judgment and mercy. And the prophets play with words and images to play off both of those sides. One more little passage from Isaiah. In Isaiah chapter 11, which is this messianic vision and famous language. There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, a branch from his roots, so forth. Very famous passage. Here's how it lands in verse 9. It says, they shall not hurt or destroy in all my holy mountain. For the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And earlier, just verses earlier, it has this kind of mind-bending image of the wolf shall lie down with the lamb. The leopard shall lie down with the young goat. The calf and the lion and the fattened calf together, and a little child shall lead them. Little children are going to play over the holes of poisonous snakes. It's a profound image of nature at peace.
Yes.
Nature turning away from violence. And so actually one more passage to mention before we can summarize. In Leviticus chapter 25, we get this long passage of the idea of a jubilee. Every 50 years, there's going to be an economic reset in the land of Israel, and debts will be canceled out. People will be able to return to ancestral homelands and so forth. Because as our culture is well aware, there is such a thing as economic violence.
Right.
And the Bible is trying to say, institute something so that cannot accrue over time. There's going to be a cyclical reset. I think like Billy Graham in like the 50s or 60s was trying to call for a global jubilee on international debt. Because, especially after World War II, the reason America is so dominant is we loaned everybody money to rebuild after the war. We funded the Marshall Plan. We rebuilt Japan. And there's a lot of money involved. And so the idea of the Bible foresees that. And it's a question of whether Jubilee was ever practiced in ancient Israel. Probably not.
Oh, wow.
But the fact that it's even in there. And in fact, we could do a whole study on how Jesus in many ways frames his ministry as the year of Jubilee. The way he quotes from Isaiah 58 and 57 in Luke 4 in his first sermon in Nazareth. Jesus is playing on Jubilee concepts. So anyways, here's the upshot. Before we get into specifics, again, the old stereotype, and you hear it all the time, the Old Testament is kind of cozy with violence.
Yes.
And the New Testament, thank God, turns to peace and love. That's a very shallow reading. It totally misses how the story is set up. It totally glosses over the prophetic yearnings. It commits the fundamental mistake that a lot of people commit reading the Bible, which is confusing the descriptive for the prescriptive. Mm-hmm. Just because the Bible describes something doesn't mean it's prescribing it, saying this is what God wants.
Yes.
It's saying, here's a vivid image of how humans can destroy themselves. Mm-hmm. In defense of the scriptures of Israel, which Jesus loved, which Paul loved, it recognizes that violence is an element in our world, but it's not giving a divine stamp of approval on it, if that makes sense. I think that's the starting point.
No, that's helpful. I guess in line with that, my question in return would be if we can maybe turn to the point of guns.
Yeah.
Can Christians own guns? Mm-hmm. How does that square, certainly with what we understand, what we just talked about in the Old Testament, as well as with what Jesus taught? Jesus specifically said things like turn the cheek, love your enemies, go the extra mile. There's all sorts of things that we've kind of brought together to say, oh, well, didn't Jesus just mean never be violent, never, ever, ever use a weapon?
Yep.
I'm kind of nodding at pacifism here, but how does owning a gun specifically square with what we know from the scriptures?
Yeah. So there's really two questions there, and let's try to take them one at a time.
Let's do it.
And let's start just with the landscape of firearms in our culture. The basic thing is that guns come in many types and with many different purposes. So the word gun will mean something very different to someone living in the inner city than it will to somebody who lives in rural America. Mm-hmm. I grew up in rural America. Mm-hmm. I grew up in Montana. And firearms, first of all, are treated with great reverence because, in order to go hunting, you have to take hunter safety class, and it's like uber safety. And then hunting is a way of life.
This is actually a personal experience that I've had. So I grew up in the Bay Area of California. Yeah. Much near cities. I grew up going to church in San Francisco for a very long time. Guns were associated so closely with violence for me that it was like I couldn't think gun and not think crime.
Right, exactly.
And there were very particular visions of what it meant to own a gun or to not own a gun and probably have it illegally. But then when I met my husband, who's from Montana, and I visited Montana, it was so interesting to see culturally the deep reverence for that thing that sat in their pocket. Not because they worshipped it, but because they understood the power that they wielded. Yeah. And that actually meant that there were sometimes greater measures of safety. Yeah. And also that there was a deep reverence for life and respect for life. It was so interesting to experience those two things clashing because to me it was always the narrative of if you own a gun, you're probably just wielding it real crazy and hurting people.
Right. Yeah. No, in Montana, often hunters get characterized as sort of like, you just like slaughtering things.
Right. Yeah.
There are those people that exists.
Yes.
But in my experience and in my own family, there is something sacred and solemn about harvesting a life.
Okay, that is exactly what I experienced when in conversations with family and friends from Montana.
Yeah, I mean, when you come up to a deer, say, whose life you have just taken, and often when you get there, it's still alive. Mm-hmm. Unless you're a sociopath, you're aware that you're in the presence of a living creature that very much wants to live.
Yes.
And when you take its life, you make that decision, and you're saying, I'm not just doing this for fun. This is going to feed my family for the next year.
Right. Yes.
Honestly, my family, we would pray. Like before we started to field dress the animal, like, I hope that's not TMI, but all that to say is it's when you go to the supermarket and you get your packaged meat and everything, you are removed from the graphic reality that this thing was once alive. Mm-hmm. A human being took its life. Yep. And actually being exposed to that is sort of a primal experience. Mm-hmm. And the twinge that you feel does put you in touch with the Bible, where you're like, yeah, it wasn't until Genesis 9 that God said that this was okay. And actually, I was a vegetarian for some years when I lived in Israel, and well, we may circle back to that season of my life when we talk about pacifism and so forth.
Okay.
But I think that, you can make a real case for being a vegetarian. And, but a lot of the most thoughtful conservationists, environmentalists that I know are people of the earth who actually are daily involved in this interchange of life and death. None of that negates the experience of people in the inner city who've had family members killed with gun violence.
Yes.
That's a real thing. And so, that's the basic point, is that we're talking about a diverse phenomena here. Yes.
Yes.
And so, but a statement that I think is important is that the remedy for abuse or misuse is not disuse, it is proper use. Humans have a tendency to say anything that has a potential downside, we're just going to do away with it altogether. So Christians do this all the time with things like alcohol, with things like sex, with things like movies, with things like secular music, with things like guns.
That's a great point.
But the world is freighted with risk. That's part of what it means to be alive. So I guess what I'm saying is I actually do think Christians can own firearms if they are used for things like outdoorsmanship. Also, in a place like Montana, you do need them for personal protection. If you're going to get mauled by a bear, I would prefer to stay alive and the bear not. Or, a cougar or a wolf or something. That's real.
Oh, yeah.
And also, if you need personal protection, I think protection is a fine impulse. So there's that. Let's talk about Jesus.
Yeah.
Because Jesus did say things, and remember, he lived under Roman occupation, where there were people. They're called the Sicarii. The book of Acts calls them the assassins. Oh, interesting. Paul in Acts 22 is before the magistrates in Jerusalem. And the Roman magistrate says, "Aren't you that Egyptian who led the 4,000 assassins out into the desert?" And Paul's like, no. I'm Paul. I'm from Tarsus, and I'm about Jesus.
Yeah, wrong guy.
Yeah, but many think that Judas Iscariot was one of these Sicarii guys, that the Iscariot might mean man of the dagger, and they would have daggers under their cloaks, and in broad daylight in crowds, they would assassinate people. Jesus lives in a rowdy world.
Yeah.
And so when he's saying things like, if your enemy slaps you on one cheek, turn the other cheek. If he forces you to go 1 mile, go 2 miles.
This is stuff that's actually happening.
Oh, yeah. This stuff has bite in his world. And he's under a lot of pressure from segments of his society to endorse violent revolt, violent resistance.
Right.
And by the way, the template of someone 200 years prior to Jesus, like Judas Maccabeus and his brothers,
right,
and the Jewish guerrilla freedom fighters who actually threw off the Greeks at the time and for 200 years, or 100 years, say, established a Jewish kingdom, that was the template. We want you to be that guy.
Right.
And so this is Jesus' world.
Finish the job, Jesus.
But the other thing that's often not noticed is Jesus says some things on the other side of the debate that we need to be aware of. So famously, Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, and Peter draws his sword, starts hacking away. He's a terrible shot. He hits the guy's ear. It's like Dumb and Dumber. Harry, you're alive. But you're a terrible shot. I don't know if you get the reference. But here's the point. Was Jesus surprised that Peter had a sword? It's like, oh my God, Peter, I had no idea you were carrying a sword.
Yeah, probably not.
He just says, Peter, put that away. He doesn't say, Peter, go throw it into the lake. How dare you? Well, that's interesting. Okay. In Matthew 10:34, Jesus says, do not think that I've come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. And then he goes on to say, brother will fight against brother, parents against their children, and so forth. He's saying, I am a polarizing presence, and there is going to be conflict because of me. And so the sort of like the peace and love Jesus that, is in the petting zoo all the time, like there's another side of Jesus, and he's aware that there's going to be profound conflict. Here's a passage in Luke 22. Not fully sure what to make of it, to be honest, but let me read it to you. So Jesus said to them, when I sent you out with no money bag or knapsack or sandals, did you lack anything? They said, nothing. He said to them, but now let the one who has a money bag take it, and likewise a knapsack, and let the one who has no sword sell his cloak and buy one. For I tell you that this scripture must be fulfilled, and he was numbered with the transgressors, that's Isaiah 53, For what is written about me has its fulfillment. And they said, look, Lord, here are 2 swords. And he said to them, it is enough. I don't fully know what to make of that.
I don't know what to make of that either.
The fact that he says 2 swords is enough, I think, suggests that Jesus is not advocating a serious armed revolt. 2 swords is nothing. Let me back up the truck real quick just to be clear about something. I forgot to say this. The reason we're talking about Jesus and swords is, in my mind anyways, the sword as a personal weapon in Jesus' day is something of an analog of the gun as a personal weapon in our day. In Jesus' day, you could strap a sword to your waist. In our day, you can strap a gun to your waist. And it's your personal violence agency in the world. And so that's why we're talking about what Jesus has to say about swords.
Okay, I'm just musing here.
Yeah.
I'm just thinking about what you just read in Luke.
Yeah.
And to some degree, this is just on a cursory read here, obviously. But I'm just thinking through maybe the idea that Jesus is aware that because of the way that the world is, not just how it ought to be, but the way that the world is, prefers nonviolence, but is also very aware that the world is scrappy. And there is maybe a place for self-defense of some kind, right? Like, do you think if someone were to jump one of Jesus's disciples, that like he would just be like, just lay there, okay? Just wait till it's over.
Play dead.
Like, play dead or something. But I don't know, just practically speaking, again, this is not me really building a theology behind this because I would need to do more reading about that. But I don't know, I see that as kind of making a little bit of space for how scrappy the world is and the reality that like, guys, come prepared. And what I don't mean by that is that Jesus is like, go purchase a gun and go get a sword so that you can, just in case somebody comes at you. But just again, like just nodding at this reality that like things are not how they ought to be. And there's maybe some space for other realities to speak into that then.
Yeah. And also the world is complex because the world is not filled with one-on-one interactions. C.S. Lewis, he wrote an essay during World War II called Why I Am Not a Pacifist. And his basic argument is to say, look, as a Christian, if you attack me physically, I can and maybe should not resist. But what if I'm A and you're B, and B is attacking C, who is vulnerable to B? Then I have a duty to do whatever is necessary to stop B from abusing C.
Yeah. I don't know if this is fair to say, but it seems a little bit like the West has a sense of, I know this is a hot topic word, but the West has a sense of privilege in that we live in pretty relative safety.
Yeah, totally.
And so
especially
pacifism and this idea of just being non-combative in any way, shape, or form under any circumstance is a bit of a privileged idea because if you're anywhere else in the world and you've seen real violence, especially against the vulnerable and the innocent, and the sense of justice that rightfully wells up inside of you, and I think nods at God's own sense of justice towards evil, I think is a great way of talking about why pacifism always, in all circumstances, doesn't work.
Yeah, so let's get into that. Let's turn then from the sort of the mano a mano personal violence question, of which guns is a good test case, to the question of war.
Yeah, because that's at scale. This is violence at scale.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And so there is a long tradition of Christian thought called just war theory. How do you approach the prospect of war with justice? Once you cross that threshold and are engaged in war, how do you fight in a just manner? After the war concludes, how do you post-bellum? What do you do that is just? And people like St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, major theorists here, and that theory has spilled over into secular discourse as well. This whole body of thought is trying to reconcile 2 things. The Bible's commitment to peace and order and beauty and those things, and the harsh reality that we live in a world where there are evil actors. how do you reconcile that? So let me just read to you, give you a taste of some of these principles. So this is called Jus Ad-Bellum, which means the justice of going to war. How do you even think about if it's proper to declare war? Several principles here. It's got to have a just cause. So let me just read for a minute here to get some stuff out. War must be waged for a morally just reason, such as self-defense, protection of innocent lives, or correcting a grave injustice. Aggressive wars for conquest or gain are not considered just. Number 2, legitimate authority. War must be declared and conducted by a legitimate governing authority, not by private individuals or rogue groups. So it's not like I'm going to declare war on Canada myself and like, you know what, I'm at war with Canada.
Right, sure.
And contrarily, if the U.S. government decides we're at war with Canada, well, then now I'm at war with Canada.
Right.
They decided that's legitimate authority. Number 3, right intention. The motivation for going to war must be good, such as seeking peace or justice, cannot be driven by hatred, revenge, or desire for economic or territorial gain. Number 4, last resort. War should only be undertaken when all other means of resolving the conflict, such as diplomacy, negotiations, and sanctions, have been exhausted. 5, probability of success. There must be a reasonable chance of success. Wars that are futile or that would cause more harm than good should not be fought. 6, proportionality. The anticipated benefits of waging war must be proportionate to the harm and destruction it will cause. War should not create more harm than the injustice it seeks to address. So all of these calculations are prior to even declaring war. Now, once you've crossed that threshold, how should war be conducted? First, several principles here. First, there needs to be discrimination or immunity for non-combatants. Combatants, soldiers, must distinguish between military targets and non-combatant civilians. Innocent people should never be, keyword, deliberately targeted or harmed. Mm-hmm. There are always, and it is a major threat, there are always casualties of people. And, you know, I think the war in the Middle East is a great example of people who deliberately, Saddam Hussein did this for years. It's called the human shield principle, where you say we're going to, hide ourselves behind innocence. Okay. Right. 2, proportionality in the use of force. The use of force must be proportionate to the military objective, and excessive force or unnecessary destruction should be avoided. 3, no evil means. Combatants must not use immoral tactics, such as genocide, rape, torture, or other inhumane practices, even if these tactics might lead to victory. I remember I got to visit Oslo, Norway once, where the Nobel Prize Center is. Mm-hmm. And this was in 2010 that I was there. And in 2008, Barack Obama won the Nobel Peace Prize. Uh-huh. So there was a big exhibit for Obama. And so I listened to a speech, and he said something like, well, it's ironic for commander-in-chief of a nation currently in 2 wars to be given the Nobel Peace Prize. Mm. And then he went on to talk about, among other things, how if in the quest for justice we are forced to do things that are themselves unjust, then we've undermined our own moral authority. And here that's getting to this idea of no evil means. Right. And then there's the ideas of justice after war, and this has to do with restoration of peace, punishment for war crimes, rehabilitation. There should be efforts to rebuild and rehabilitate societies that have been devastated. By the way, this has been the U.S. Let's go back to Abraham Lincoln. In his second inaugural address, he talks about with charity for all and malice towards none. And Abraham Lincoln, before he died, was a major advocate for Reconstruction in the South, the merciful treatment of enemies. It was, as I mentioned earlier, the United States that in the Marshall Plan post-World War II, U.S. dollars rebuilt Germany. And why? Because it was the idea, Teddy Roosevelt was big into this as well. The idea is be merciful to your enemies, and after when they're on their butt, actually help them back up. And it's better to have a friend than an enemy. Yeah. So not at all saying that ours or any nation has been perfect at this, but it is to say there have been real world attempts to try to implement some of these things. Mm-hmm. Last I'll say then is, if you're listening to this and you want to go deeper here, There are thoughtful Christian voices who are proponents of just war theory, and some who are against it, who take a principled pacifist stance. And so I brought a few books that may be helpful for that. So this is New Testament scholar named Richard Hayes. The Moral Vision of the New Testament is the book, and there's a whole chapter in here on violence in defense of justice, and he takes a pacifist stance. Other pacifist Christian thinkers are people like John Howard Yoder, notably Stanley Hauerwas, and then famous political figures, people like Martin Luther King Jr., people like Leo Tolstoy. Leo Tolstoy, actually, who was a very interesting Christian figure, was the inspiration for Mahatma Gandhi.
Oh.
Gandhi was a 20-something, 30-something lawyer in South Africa and was so taken with the Christian writings of Leo Tolstoy that him and his buddies started a commune called Tolstoy Farms. And he lived for a long time in Tolstoy Farms, and his subsequent political activism in India was deeply oriented by Tolstoy. And then Martin Luther King Jr. took over some Gandhi stuff. I'm trying to draw this lineage here. So go ahead.
No, I mean, I'm going to ask, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Where do you land?
Yeah.
In this conversation? Because there's a lot of big voices here.
Yeah.
Where do you find yourself in this conversation?
Yeah. Let me just mention two other sources before I answer that. So on the modern voices for just war are people like Reinhold Niebuhr, people like this is a guy named Nigel Bigger. This is a book called In Defense of War. He's a professor of, I think, moral philosophy at Oxford. It's a whole book saying, like, yes, of course, war is terrible. Yes, of course, we should avoid it at all costs. And yes, of course, it still has a place in the world. And it's like a thick book. A guy named Paul Ramsey, Christian ethicist. I'm just trying to give you a sense of maybe where to start if you're interested in going deeper here. For me, I think I've reconciled that I think evil has to be addressed at two different levels. The New Testament is aware of both levels, but the Christian faith is grounded in the eschatological hope of God addressing evil once and for all for good.
Right.
There's the eschatological level. There's also the historical level where we live today between the ages. The world is not yet perfect. So I think, for me, I believe that pacifism is a prophetic witness of the day when God makes all to be well. Just like in Catholic circles, priestly celibacy is seen as an eschatological sign of the age of resurrection where there will be no more marriage. And so I think that there is a place for pacifism. Historically, however, I do think that it's the case that if everybody were pacifists, the bullies would just win and the world would be terrible. And the irony has often been noted that, the Amish communities in rural Ohio and Pennsylvania couldn't even afford to be pacifists unless the states of Ohio and Pennsylvania had law enforcement and National Guards. So it's kind of like what's the word? Not leeching, but sort of like you have the privilege of being pacifist because there is law enforcement.
Sure.
So, Nigel Bigger wrote an essay that I read in a periodical, First Things, called, and this guy's British, but it's called In Defense of American Empire. And this guy's saying, like, look, we British tried the empire thing and it didn't go great and it had some seedy undersides. But here's his whole argument. Well, if the American empire collapses, what will take its place is the Chinese empire. And I would much rather live in a world that has an American stamp on it than a Chinese stamp. So it's a very pragmatic, just sort of like at the end of the day, either Washington or Beijing, and I'm choosing Washington.
Sure.
You could call that cynical or you could call it realistic.
Yeah.
And so for me, actually, let me give you a short story first. So I told you when I lived in Israel, I was reading a lot of Tolstoy. And I did become a vegetarian, and I was like 23, trying to figure out.
Yeah.
And I'm all about like running the experiment. Like I read a book, and I'm like, I'm gonna change my life. I've done that many times.
Yeah.
But then one day, my mentor there said to me something. He's so brilliant. He would just say these little things that would just like shake me. He'd say, Ryan, if Gandhi, you're reading Gandhi. Oh, yeah, it's very interesting. Well, if Gandhi was really following Jesus' advice, why did Gandhi tell us, if your enemy forces you to go on the road with him, lay down and refuse? Why didn't he say, if your enemy forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2? I thought, I don't have an answer for that, actually. But it was actually talking about Jesus's non-resistance is even more radical than someone like Gandhi or someone like Martin Luther King Jr. Jesus was, and I'm not saying those things have no moral foundation, but Jesus was not hosting sit-ins, or he was not doing this resistance element. Actually,
well, and not just resistance. I'm almost picking up on like the difference between abstinence and service. Do you see what I'm saying there?
Yes.
Yeah. There's holy activity there.
Yes.
That's kind of an undercurrent. I'm curious to know if pacifism versus maybe violent resistance in a just way, if that's a poor way of describing it, but between the two, in terms of what you're describing, is it a matter of discernment, right? I think about Christians in all sorts of places around the world who have gone the pacifist route, and a great deal of good has come from it. People even coming to know the Lord because of it.
Yep.
Also, your point is taken in terms of what of Christian generals and people who protect the peace, even at a civic level, police officers, different thing like that, people who love the Lord and who also want to guard the vulnerable and make sure that there is appropriate, proportional punishment for crime.
Yes.
And for violence.
Yes. A lot of the pacifist movement often has an anthropology that assumes humans are good. That says, like, at the end of the day, if I just say, let's get all along and I'm not going to fight you, surely you won't fight me back. Okay, go ahead and try that.
Yeah.
Now, two things are important to note here. One, Jesus himself took the radical prophetic route. Jesus chose to die. The way Jesus attacked evil was to say to evil, do your worst. And that is a profound and enduring example. That's very important. The other thing that's important to recognize is the New Testament is written at a time when Christians are a minority of a minority in the Roman world. They're not in a place socially that they need to ponder the ambiguities of Christians in power. Christians with...
It just wasn't going to be a reality.
They're not in a place to run for office or anything like that. They're a tiny marginal group. So that's important to notice as well. We can't expect it to answer questions that it itself was not asking at the time. So I guess the upshot here for me for war is that I think there's a place for both. There is a place for Christian pacifism and its eschatological witness. There is also a place for Christian officers and soldiers to be guardians of the vulnerable, guardians of the weak, guardians of the beautiful. And I think both are necessary.
Okay. All right. Well, let's switch gears. I appreciate you kind of fleshing that out for us. I want to talk about abortion. Is that something that well-meaning Christians can disagree on? Or is there pretty much a singular path to take on that issue?
Yeah. Well, you know me, I'm all about saying, thoughtful people can see this. There's a couple different ways to see this.
Sure.
But on this, I actually think it's pretty clear from a biblical standpoint, because this gets to fundamental issues about what it means to be a human. What does it mean to be a body plus soul entity? What does it mean to be a sexual creature that can love and have pleasure and procreate? What is at stake in these sorts of things? I want to start with the philosophical side of things. So there's a long-standing rival and sometimes even sort of intruder to the Christian worldview, and it's what's called Gnosticism. It comes from the Greek word gnosis, means knowledge. And what Gnosticism says, it splits the human being into two, into the body side and the soul side, material and immaterial, and it elevates the immaterial over the material. So what really makes me me is more my feelings, my spirit, my identity,
The immaterial experience.
And that can be divorced from my physicality.
Mm-hmm.
And historically, once you make that valuation, historically it can go one of two directions. You get the Christians, so both are dualists, but you get the Christian dualists who are like sort of like body haters. And they beat the body, scourge the body. The body is a prison. The body is my enemy. The body is wicked. I must escape this body so I can get to heaven. There's that. We all recognize that. On the other hand, there's the sort of body coddling Christianity that says, well, my body doesn't really matter anyways. It's kind of my playground. What really matters is my soul. And if I can use my body to make my soul feel good, then I'm going to do whatever, because it's not of ultimate significance.
Yeah.
And so same error, two very different embodiments of it. But the biblical view is different. It says the body is not a prison. It's not a playground. It's a temple. It is a holy fusion of material and immaterial, flesh and spirit. It's an overlap place of heaven and earth. By the way, sidebar, but this is why the doctrine of resurrection is so very important. And Christian Platonists are also Christian Gnostics who say, well, the real happy ending of the Christian story is, I died, but my soul flew away to heaven. The Bible says, yes, to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord, but that's not the end of the story. The end of the story is new bodies, is resurrection, is healed materiality. It is a dynamic unity. So when resurrection is marginalized and the whole Christian story and all of our hymns and all of our literature is all about going to heaven when you die, you can be sure that Gnosticism is lurking nearby and its dangers. Now, that little lesson, let's bring it home to the question
where does that come to bear?
Yeah, let's bring it to the issue of abortion. In our culture, what motivates nonchalance about abortion, or what is willing to recode human life to fetal tissue, is precisely Gnosticism. Because if this little zygote, this little embryo or whatever, if it can't feel anything, if it's not sentient, if it doesn't have consciousness, well then what's the problem with eliminating it? It's not human. But that assumes that unless you have something we would recognize as soul or gnosis or whatever you want to call it, in the absence of that, it must be subhuman.
Right. Well, you take that to its logical conclusion. You're not just grouping in zygotes in a woman's womb. You are talking about elderly people struggling with dementia. You're talking about kids and young adults and adults with special needs. A number of different persons who are not functioning at what we might describe as full capacity or normal, right? In reference to certain elements of our sentience. And that's extremely problematic from a Christian perspective. From a secular perspective, you might be able to do some do-si-dos around that. But in terms of the Christian ethic, what you're saying is that it's unambiguous. God has made everyone in his image, and they are all persons from conception.
Yes. And I believe the word conception, because there's all sorts of, adjudicating these different stages. My understanding is conception is the umbrella term that has both fertilization and implantation. Because there's a difference in time between fertilization and implantation. Conception refers to all of that. Let me read you something from professor of jurisprudence, political philosophy. His name's Robert George. I think he's still at Princeton. He says this in an article, and just what you inferred, Destiny. He said, if we take the Gnostic view, then those in embryonic, fetal, and early infant stages are not yet persons.
Right.
On the other hand, those who have lost the immediate control of certain mental powers, victims of advanced dementias, the long-term comatose, the minimally conscious, they are no longer persons. So assisted suicide, which many see as the humane thing to do. Why is it humane? Well, because we're not really dealing with a person here anymore, are we? And so this is and
that person is then no longer worth the resources that we spend to keep them alive.
Yeah. Now, to be honest, ethics are ambiguous and hard because I used to pray when I was a kid. This was like part of my nightly prayer when I was like 4 or 5. And Lord, give me a quick death, preferably when I'm asleep one night. Because I didn't want to suffer. I didn't want like this prolonged agony.
I actually really,
when it's time to die, I just want to go.
Oh, I resonate with that. Absolutely.
And so, when you see it from that standpoint, like if somebody has just like, just like this massively painful existence, death is a mercy.
Yeah, no, I hear that.
But it's ultimately not up for us to decide. And that's
hard to reconcile.
It is.
Yeah.
It is.
And I don't want to, in having this conversation, make it seem like it's just so obvious. It's just so easy.
Yeah.
Really, what a cruel person you are to consider abortion as an option.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I maybe in line with that, I do want to touch a little bit on what is a core talking point for our culture on the issue of abortion, which is the mother,
yes,
the woman's body, uniquely outfitted to carry this child.
Yep.
And thus there is more of a weight to bear frequently on the female body than the male body, obviously, in rearing this child, especially in the early stages, before the child exits the womb.
Yep.
And so in light of that, how does Christian thinking factor into these conversations about the woman's body?
Yeah. And that's very important. And there's all sorts of little quips that people throw out as sort of conversation stoppers. I'm pro-woman too.
Sorry, I forgot.
The little woman in the womb.
You can't speak to this because you're a man.
Oh, that's right. You know what? I'll shut up. I can't have any thoughts. Thank you, Destiny, for
I'm kidding.
checking my privilege. I appreciate that. For me, philosophy makes sense when I'm trying, that's often how I approach things. Christianity says, here's the deepest insight into the universe. There's a creator, God, full of love, and God's heart, the essence of it is self-giving love. Human creatures are made in the image of that God. Therefore, we become fully human when self-giving love animates our own life as well. Mm-hmm. Now, how this, to bring it a little closer to the current topic, Pope John Paul II, in his book, Man and Woman, He Created Them, observed that our bodies, our gendered bodies, are inscribed with the language of love. Humans come into the world with latent capacities for love, because not only the love of giving yourself to a sexual partner and a spouse, but the commitment to the product of that sexual love, i.e. a child. That is to say, and you can't split off the abortion question from the sexual ethics question. Mm-hmm. That is to say, the possibility of long-term commitment and loyalty is part of the deal here. And that applies, let me just say that applies just as much to men as to women.
Okay, yeah.
And that's the
exactly
wicked, I would say demonic thing, because if God is self-giving love, then anti-God is the, hey, let me impregnate my girlfriend, then bounce. And then put her in the awful position of having to say, oh, so my choices are either an abortion or the very hard road of being a single mom. I hold that man completely responsible.
Yep.
That's wicked.
Yep.
So self-giving love pinches men and women differently, but nobody's exempted from the rigors of it.
Thank you. Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to press into. I think too, often in this conversation, there is a particular concern for a marginal group, some people, marginal group exception, specifically people who experience rape, incest, or potentially a medical issue that compromises the life of the mother, where maybe a potential choice has to be made there. I just want to speak for a moment to the issue of rape and incest. Violent and vile describes both of those things. Mm-hmm. The difficulty that I have with abortion being the route taken, I think there's oftentimes it's women speaking about it who haven't been through this thing, saying, "Oh, but would you want to look at the face of a child that looked like your offender?"
Yeah.
And to that, I would simply respond, there are plenty of things that can remind us of a traumatic event. But more than that, since when do we ever penalize a child for the sin of a father? When do we do that? And give me another case that's normal. Mm-hmm. And we've already talked about the issue of personhood and Imago Dei and stuff, so that's why I'm not particularly using that argument in this moment.
Yeah.
But also violence on violence, right? So there's the level of violence towards the mother, and then adding violence to the mother's body through the process of abortion, because it is violent. It's not just violent to the child. The mother's body goes through terrible things in order to expel that child from her body.
Yeah.
Adding violence to violence does not solve the psychological and physical complexities of this situation. And to me, the beautiful thing about the gospel is that we don't just say, you'll get a new body one day, but there's actually and there's data on this in secular spaces as well. The brain can heal, the body can heal, and all the more with Christ. And so what I'm not saying is that these things aren't awful, terrible, traumatic, just to the nth degree. But what I am saying is that is the very audacity of the gospel in which we preach, that there is not just hope in the future, but that Christ can heal in a measure now.
Yeah.
And that our brains can heal, our bodies can heal, and we can also rear children that bring great joy to our lives and are a part of that healing. And that is offensive in a sense, because it's like, how could any good come from that evil? And to that I would respond, you must just not know God. Because having been through something not exactly like this, but similar, I have to say, regardless of the offense, their visceral experiences of love transform. And God is capable of doing that. So that would be my response to that.
Well said. Thank you for sharing that, Destiny. And I mean, at the beginning you were quipping. You're a man. You can't speak to this, but there is a real truth in which my vantage to this is removed at a certain level. Yeah. And so to hear you share those thoughts is like really powerful. Thank you for sharing
and
that.
To share, I have 3 children. I've been through 3 pregnancies that have all been successful, but I also recognize that there's huge complexity, and the number of times that throughout those pregnancies and the difficulties in those, realizing the experience of how quickly selfishness can creep in, even as a mother with my children on the other side of the womb now. Like it is so easy, and how soothing culture can be to your ear in those moments. Yeah. But I want to encourage you, and those Christians who say they are for life, I want to encourage you, please, would you remember not just the arguments against abortion, but the people who really need support in order to make the right choice. Yeah.
Yeah. Our church works closely with a group called Options for Women, and it's for people in crisis pregnancies. Yep. And saying, geez, there are options, aren't there?
Yes.
Adoption is an option. Different support is, I can take this baby to full term. Yep. And really thoughtful, kind people who get into the weeds of the complexity and walk with you. And that's just so very important. And you know, you mentioned a few moments ago what happens when the mother's life is at risk, or these kinds of things.
Thank you for bringing that back on.
You know, like I said at the beginning, I'm not an ethicist. I don't know. But to me, the common sense move there is to say, look, if the mother's going to die, save the mother's life. But also, given medical technology, that's pretty rare nowadays. And so we can't build a whole philosophy of abortion on that outlier. And when you start to try to adjudicate, and the question is, where do we turn the dial? Is it 6 weeks or 8 weeks or 4 weeks or whatever? That's missing the big picture, the gravitas of the question. Interestingly, one of the reasons that Christianity gained social momentum in the early centuries is that infanticide was very normal. When archaeologists, do ancient cemetery digs, lots of baby bones.
Yeah.
Not just because infant mortality and they just died of natural causes that we can heal today, but infanticide, especially baby girls, was common because this social cachet of men versus women and so forth. The early church was very attractive to women because it dignified them. They were in leadership roles. It protected them sternly from the predations of men, and also from the just sort of casual concubines and hookup, prostitute culture. Christianity and Judaism was countercultural in their monogamous marriage ethic. And so it was a good deal for women, actually. That was part of how it grew, is that it would take in children that were abandoned. An unwanted child would be left on the doorstep of the temple or whatever, and is assumed, well, who knows what's going to happen. The Christians would take that kid in. And so this ethic has been part of the Christian story. And this is where the gospel hits ground, in real life. And love, Martin Buber, Jewish philosopher, has a quote that I love. He says, "Love is responsibility of the I for the thou." You can't say I love, like what it means when you say I love you is I'm taking responsibility for your well-being. And that is inconvenient. That costs dollars, that costs time, that costs attention.
Yep.
But anything less is not love.
Thank you. I think that was a succinct way to say a very powerful truth.
Thank Martin Buber.
Yes, thank you, Martin. I want to land the plane here.
Yeah.
Let's talk just very briefly about the death penalty, because that does also land within the scope of our conversation.
Yeah.
I think of maybe some examples in the Old Testament, like stoning, right? Like there were consequences prescribed for, I don't know if you want to make the differentiation between crime or sin. Like, were those two things kind of the same thing in that culture? How would that read today? I guess what I'm asking is there any situation in which humans taking another human's life as a consequence of an offense appropriate?
Yeah, it's a great question. And this is one certainly on which Christians that I know disagree.
Yeah.
Christians who I know they love Jesus in the Bible, and they do see this differently.
Yeah.
Many will point to a verse that we already read, Genesis 9:6. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed.
Right. I'm familiar with that one.
And why?
Yeah.
Because man was made in the image of God. So there are consequences for okay. Here, honestly, this is one where I admit that my theology interfaces with my desires. I want to believe that Jesus overturns this. That is to say, famous story, John 8, woman is thrown down in the middle. Jesus, the Torah says we should stone a woman caught in adultery. What do you say? And Jesus starts writing in the dirt. Only time we see him writing. What's he doing? Writing the names of all the people who shacked up with her that are standing right there? We don't know. But he does say, he who's without sin, let them throw the first stone. They all go away because they've all been faced. But then he says to the woman, go and sin no more. So Jesus doesn't say to her, oh, those meanies, you go live your best life now. And he says,
live your truth.
Go and sin no more.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
You brought up an important distinction that we might not often think about, which is that crime in our culture today, crime and sin are not the same things. If I commit adultery,
you're not going to
jail. The state of California is not going to put me in prison.
Your wife hates you, but you're not going to jail.
My wife is going to be very upset.
Yeah.
But in cultures where there is no distinction between religion and politics, crime and sin are one and the same. I was in Iraq in 2012 and visited a Yazidi community, which is a religious minority, persecuted. And at the time, ISIS was a thing.
Yep.
And my understanding is there was a girl in the community who got caught hooking up with an ISIS guy. So they took this girl to the center of the village, and I was there. I was like standing right there. Everybody saw it on the international news, and they stoned her publicly to death. In this Yazidi, now the Yazidis are usually framed as a persecuted religious minority. But does that mean they too don't persecute? Or they don't, I mean, for them, it was a crime, it was a sin, and it was death. And being there in that place was just like, it was surreal. It was like, oh my God, like this is where this happened. And I would like to think that I'll just put my cards on the table. I don't want to live in a world in which there's a death penalty. I know a lot of Christians, like in Europe, look at Americans and think we're barbaric, that we still do have a death penalty. Mm-hmm. I do also know, look, you can't let your theology be totally driven by your desires. Mm-hmm. Romans 13 says this, Romans 13:4. Paul is writing to Christians. If you do wrong, then be afraid. For the governor does not bear the sword in vain. He is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. We also even see, you could say, God putting in play the death penalty a couple times, even in the New Testament. Mm-hmm. In Acts chapter 5, Ananias and Sapphira.
Yes.
They lie about their generosity, and God says no, and they die. And interestingly, it falls in the same place of the story as the story of Achan in Joshua chapter 7. Right after the high point of Jericho, there's a greed moment, and the whole show comes to a stop, and Achan dies. Just so, right after the day of Pentecost and the church is gathering steam, there's this greed moment and deception moment, and it's Ananias, and the whole thing stops, and they die. Mm-hmm. And, there's parallels in Korah's rebellion, number 16, Nadab and Abihu, Aaron's sons, Leviticus 10. Now, the argument would say, now, wait a minute, if you're against abortion, how can you be pro-capital punishment? Right. Because a life is a life.
Right.
To which I think the answer is, there's a difference between innocence and guilt.
Yeah.
A fetus is innocent. Mm-hmm. A mass murderer is not. Mm-hmm. So I'm just these are the arguments.
Yep.
Many in our generation have been influenced by this book. I think it's been made into a movie.
Yes, I saw the movie.
Now a major motion picture. It says on the cover.
Just Mercy.
Just Mercy, a story of justice and redemption. Brian Stevenson, he's an attorney who worked with death row inmates, some of whom wrongly convicted. Profound and sobering insight into what it looks like to be on death row. It is a biblical principle. Is this in the Bible or is this Shakespeare? I'm not sure. Think maybe both.
Is it a Taylor Swift lyric or is it David?
But I think the phrase I'm looking for is mercy triumphs over judgment. Is that Shakespeare? This is Shakespeare. Then doth earthly judgment show likest God's.
Oh, I know it from a famous worship
mercy
song.
Mercy seasons justice.
Yeah.
Who do you know it from?
It's a famous worship song.
Well, that too.
Yeah.
That too. Shakespeare, Hillsong, they're all
the same. But yeah.
So where's the place for mercy? So again, I guess where I come down on that one is it wrenches me. I would like to believe that we're not putting people to death in San Quentin. Mm-hmm. I do know thoughtful Christians who see that differently and see deterrence as effective.
Sure.
Thomas Sowell at Stanford says, he quips in an essay, he says, the fact that I've never killed an editor is evidence that the death penalty has a deterrent effect. That's funny.
Okay, so here's the bigger question than even the big question. Is violence forever?
Yeah.
What hope do we have? And we'll end here because this has been a thoughtful but a long episode.
Yeah.
And thank you for those who have kept in it with us because I think this has been worth it.
You're the remnant if you're still listening.
Yeah. But will violence be forever? What do we have?
Yeah.
What hope do we have, if any?
Yeah, thanks for bringing us there because the Bible ends at a very different place than how the Bible starts. The Bible is quickly chronicling a fall into a violent world in the first chapters of the Bible. The end of the Bible addresses and redresses that. So Genesis 21 and 22, which you got to read sometime, it's saturated with the language of Eden, the language of temple. It's really profound.
Excuse me, Revelation.
Yes.
Revelation.
Did I miss?
You said Genesis.
Oh yeah. Sorry.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Revelation 21 and 22.
Okay.
Let me read this for you. I'm in verse 3. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, "Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away. And he who was seated on the throne said, Behold, I am making all things new. Also he said, Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. And he said to me, It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give from the spring of the water of life without payment. The one who conquers will have this heritage. I will be his God, and he will be my son. It's this beautiful image of an existence beyond violence, beyond pain, beyond death, beyond mourning. All of those things are the consequences of violence, right? All of that is gone. Now, Christians usually stop reading it right there, but you got to read the rest, because there is a demarcation of who gets to experience that one day. Next verse says, As for the cowardly, the faithless, the detestable, as for murderers, the people who make a practice of violence, the sexually immoral, sorcerers, idolaters, and all liars, their portion will be in the lake that burns with fire and sulfur, which is the second death. So not only is violence done away with, those who have relied upon violence will not participate in that world. So, yes, it is, you can think about the cross itself of Jesus Christ as a massive sword thrust into the ground. And Jesus, like God saying, here's my way of dealing with violence is absorbing all violence into my own eternal heart. And I am turning these swords into an implement of beauty. And that is the end game. And that is why ultimately, Miroslav Volf writes about this too. That eschatological vision is the premise of Christian pacifism now, because it means that pacifism is not about turning a blind eye to evil. The deeper insight is to say, pacifism says one day God will make all things well. Yes. One day God will deal with injustice and evil and violence, and I am going to leave that to him. And so there will be a day when pacifism is no longer necessary. There will be a day when war is no longer necessary. That's not a New Testament innovation. That is a yearning from the first pages of Genesis through David's construction of the temple, through the visions of Isaiah. It is a consistent witness of the Bible that God wants to take things to a place where all is well, and all will be well, and all manner of things will be well, in the words of the poet. And that's a beautiful hope.
Amen.
So, well, I guess we should land the plane there. Thank you for this. It's a lot of territory, but important stuff, I think. And if you are a Christian ethicist listening to this, please let us know.
Call us up.
Yeah.
Send us an email.
we did our best. But thanks for listening. And as you know, the Deeper Bible Podcast, we're in the Bay Area of California. We're located at a church called the Bay Church, and would love to see you sometime in person, or you can visit online, thebay.church. Also, as I mentioned at the beginning, if you believe in what Deeper's doing, we'd appreciate it if you'd support us. Either a one-time gift or a recurring gift, either help. They help us put together new episodes. They help us build a team, get the word out. And so we would be grateful if you'd partner with us that way. Until next time, may you be well. And as the rabbis say, shalom, homies. Take care. Bye-bye.